We'll see. I want to say that this gives you two different ways of thinking about the world, and Adrian's response then, you know, Platonism was kind of on the left, whereas what Bergson's saying was on the right. Just think for a minute about the practicalities of education and think about the way the curriculum might be organised so that it's seen in terms of more or less separate building blocks that you put together. Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3 of a particular course. And you might think also of the way it's assessed. So that for Unit 1 you know exactly what's got to be done to complete that unit. And people meet the appropriate targets which you've specified very clearly. Then you end that unit and go on to another unit. Okay, this is very familiar in terms of forms of assessment in the United States and in much of the world. Breaking things down into little finite parts and putting them together. And by contrast, well, let's still think about assessment. If you took the kind of assessment that's desired, it would be one that is very mechanistic, that shows very clearly whether someone has or has not succeeded in a task. Everything is finite. Whereas the paper that you're going to write for this course, or the thesis you're going to write, thankfully is not like that. It's much more open, much more flowing, and much more related to that dynamism that we've tried to describe, that flow, that change. And if you think about teaching and learning, then there's one conception of teaching and learning that says that everything should be planned very, very carefully, step by step, rather in the manner of programmed learning, the use of computer programs to give stages for learning that you need to go through. B.F. Skinner in the 1950s thought this was the way forward with education. And of course, computer companies have a great interest in this as well. If you want to learn spreadsheets, you can go to a program on the computer, on the internet, and it will take you through first steps, what a column is, what a row is, what a cell is, how to expand a row. And you could do this step by step, and that wouldn't be bad, because spreadsheets are not that complicated, and it's useful to learn that step by step. But most of our learning is not like that. Most of our learning is and should be about things that are much more richer, much more complicated. And then writing a thesis or writing an open-ended paper, an open-ended essay, seems much more appropriate to the task. People often can't see that because they are stuck in the Lego block way of thinking. They're stuck in a kind of Platonism to pursue the point. So think about teaching again. I mean, you might proceed step by step, knowing exactly what the student must be doing at each stage, or you might start off with a plan, but then alter it according to how people respond. And someone asks you a question you weren't expecting, and you open up the conversation around that question, and others respond. So you're working with the class in a kind of dynamism with the class, very much in the way that some comedians interact with the class. Stand-up comics, we call them. Any questions about that? Right. I'm going to show you a few film sequences in a few minutes, but can I ask you just to talk to your neighbours, whoever is convenient for you to talk to, just to share a few thoughts about what I've said and see if you can come up with a question from what you have experienced today, what I've been talking about today. Okay? Would you please do that now? Just talk to your neighbours next to you.
All the teaching and education, sometimes it can be too
Yes, I will stand here. I will look.
Okay, can I interrupt you then, please? Anybody want to comment? It's all completely clear then, is it?
We were wondering, is there a connection between what you said 2 days ago when you talked about the experience film and the message-driven film, and this idea of the semantic-driven, I don't know, idea, and the mechanically driven idea. Yeah. Is there a connection between them?
I think there may be, but the mechanically driven thing is a very specific thing, that the cogs in the machine that turns the film operate in a mechanically continuous, stable way, don't they? Just like a bicycle, for example. So part of what constructs those images is any instant whatever. In other words, it's determined by the mechanical movement of the machine. I don't think that quite matches what I talked about the other day, but there may be some connections. There's a difference in how meaning comes in, I think, in these different cases. I'll show you an example of an experience film in a minute to show what I was trying to say there.
Just I wasn't so convinced by the separation of either.
Okay.
Maybe what the connection is.
Yes, okay. Well, I mean, in a sense, neither am I, and several of you pointed out that there are surely overlaps in these things. Yeah. But if you take the contrast I developed the other day between the film that's just pushed along by narrative all the time, then a James Bond film would be an example of that.
But you still experience something, right?
Well, you experience something all the time in a certain sense. So experience is a very fluid word, and it can mean everything that's happening in our lives, or it can be specific things that we refer to or notice or are affected by. And so I think when the term experience film is used, or experience book in Foucault's terms, it's to do with the fact that you're not just reading a book to get information, that you're somehow undergoing something when you read that book. You are affected by it, you're changed by it in some sense. Like big things that happen in life affect us in that sort of way.
So it's more related to the purpose of the film as opposed to what actually happens?
Well, I'm not sure how you'd separate those two to get back at you.
It was a rhetorical question.
Well, I think to try to deal with that, I mean, I think that the makers of a James Bond film would have a clear-cut set of priorities that were guiding them in putting the story together. And that would affect their choice of location, choice of actor, dress, costumes, and so on. Frequency of the action sequences. All those things would be very carefully calculated and plotted, I think. Whereas the sequence I'm going to show you, it's much more like letting something happen and not trying to control every aspect of what the viewer sees. Anybody else, please?
We were speaking about we're calling back to educating Rita, and Wu was pointing out the. Do you want to?
Okay.
Talk about it?
I have something. Okay, so you gave us the example of water, how the water dissolved, the salt, how the salt dissolved into the water.
Yeah.
It's a very good example, I think. But coming back to the films we saw on Sunday, about the education between the Rita and Frank, this seems like the example don't perfectly serve the process of educating, because we know the water can dissolve into the salt can dissolve into in the water, and it is a one-way process. But on the other hand, the professor can educate Rita, but at the same time, the Rita can educate Frank.
Yes.
This means the process is reversible. Yeah. So maybe there's something more.
Well, okay, you said it's reversible, but I mean, in a certain sense it isn't, is it? Because the time sequence isn't reversible, so both of them are changed in the course of the story, aren't they? And you're absolutely right that there's a degree of reciprocity or interchange between them, and it's absolutely part of the point of the film that he is educating her, but in a sense she is educating him, and it's through her that he's enabled to rethink his life and to start again, in a sense. So I don't think there's any resistance to the idea that she educates him in some way, and indeed I think in some degree that's true of educational situations anyway. But the time thing is not reversible, just as it isn't for the sugar example, I think. We can't undo what's just happened to us. We can't get back to some state of innocence.
Yeah, and after our discussion, we come to a conclusion, some kind of conclusion that maybe Frank and Rita finally has formed of a kind of relation, as you mentioned. They are just like a combination, something like the dissolved water, salt in the water, just like a combination, the kind of relation.
Okay.
Is the essence.
You aren't worried that relation gets too sweet at the end? Okay. So, I mean, relation is exactly the word to refer to, and you wouldn't have any story if there weren't relations. You wouldn't have reality if there weren't relations. That's part of Bergson's point. But people tend to start with atoms and then put those atoms into combination, units, and put those units in combination, Lego blocks, put them in combination. That's the wrong way of approach, because reality is the other way round. And reality includes affect. It includes our response to change. Okay, so change and the experience of change, duration, is prior to chronological time in terms of what the world is. And because we're dealing with relations, these are infinitely extendable. It's the arena of creativity. Whereas Lego blocks, the building blocks of reality, that kind of naive physicist approach would be the reverse of that. That would be to think within a totality.
We were talking about, if I've got this right, about the difficulty if you, in terms of ideas like assessment, and how you account for those moments when different things happen, the unexpected, the changing gear, if you like, the sort of more improvised moments, how within the educational setting you account for them when so much seems to be about having predetermined outcomes and so forth. And just the difficulty of giving an account of those moments in educational terms.
Right. And what I think is very significant is that in teacher education programs, virtually no space is given to what you've just said. If something unexpected happens, then you need behaviour management skills to control it. It's not something that can be allowed to develop and alter the relations in the class or in relation to the subject matter. So I think that's very important, and I really think it would be good if we got teachers who are training to look at comedians and the way that comedians stand on a stage and talk to an audience and the kinds of rhythms they work with the audience. Another dimension to this is that when I showed you maybe even the patterns on the vent above you, these things, then for a moment you thought, well, what's he talking about? Then you thought, yes, 1, 2, 3, and then you noticed you couldn't count. And for a moment when I was talking, perhaps you were absorbed in that thing that you'd never thought before. Now, if we stayed talking about it, it would get very boring, okay? But for a moment, you're drawn into that experience. You pick up speed with that experience, just as when we looked at the reds and greens and so on. For a moment, you're drawn into that experience. Now, working with that experience, being able to let that experience develop, but not to push it too far, that's part of what works well when you're taking a class. And it's also, I think, what happens when you're writing a paper or a dissertation, that to begin with, you're trying to plan it out. and probably you're avoiding writing it. You make a cup of tea or you phone your friend or something. But then you start to write a few phrases and they connect with something else and then with something else, and you become absorbed in the thing you're doing. It doesn't go on forever. There'll come a time when you get tired, or there is a phone call, or you need to do something else, or you have to finish the essay. But it's somewhere in the middle of that experience when the experience picks up speed and it goes by itself like a dance. And you're dancing with the ideas you're working with. You're absorbed in those ideas. I think it's true when you watch a film. You know, often there are points when you become absorbed in the film, James Bond film, and you wonder what's going to happen. Is he going to catch him? Is he going to save her? You wonder what's going to happen, but then it becomes clear that the bad person is being caught and James Bond's going off with the woman to some beautiful place, and it kind of loses impetus, it loses tempo, it slows down. But being ready to move with that speed of the class, or of the writing of the essay, or of the explanation you're giving, and not going on for too long, as I may be doing now, then that's a very good thing to be able to do, I think.
Because I was giving the example, I came across a lesson plan, which I think was by a beginning teacher, in which the beginning teacher not just identified what was going to be taught, but where they were going to be at given moments in the lesson, where they were going to be standing in the room and how they were going to be moving within the actual lesson. Of course, that brought us full circle back to the making of a film, where every movement is calculated as well.
Are you talking about a lesson plan of drama class, strictly speaking, or it could be a teaching lesson plan in general?
It was a lesson plan for a particular class.
But
yeah.
when I trained to be a teacher, in my we had to write lesson plans, and we had to write what it was we were going to write on the board beforehand.
In Japan too, in general.
Yeah. So I think this applies to all subjects.
Okay,
Yeah.
thank you.
I think it can.
Okay.
She was obviously very pedantic. I don't know if most people are that detailed. But
Yes, okay. Can I just show 3 film clips?